right, Anthony, we are live in 3, 2, and 1.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. If you have even a passing interest in modern American art, you'll remember the publication back in 2005 of de Kooning, An American Master, a dazzling biography of Willem de Kooning, which won a Pulitzer Prize, a National Book Critics Circle Award, and several other accolades. Well, the formidable duo of Mark Stevens and Annalyn Swan is back with Francis Bacon, Revelations, another magnum opus in which once more they combine intellectual and psychological insight, a novelistic sense of pace, a flair for recreating entire social milieus and historical contexts, and a no stones left unturned research style to truly amazing effect. This is the first major biography of Bacon in 25 years, and it is both expansive and illuminating. Expansive in the sense that it fills out entire parts of Bacon's life that had previously been ignored, or that Bacon himself had purposely left in the dark. And illuminating in the sense that it reveals how our understanding of Bacon's life and work has been shaped so powerfully by the man himself and his close circle. That is, by friends and critics who contributed in disseminating the major tropes of his work and the elements of his personal myth. One need only watch a few of Bacon's televised interviews and conversations, which I did all weekend, with David Sylvester, but also Melvin Bragg and William Burroughs and others, to appreciate the challenge of the Bacon biographer in teasing apart the strands of Bacon's public persona from the artist within. His debonair, breezy chattiness shot through with glimpses of unguarded depth and candor. But as Stevens and Swan suggest, Bacon wasn't lying. He simply emphasized, quote, the emotional truth concealed by the deceptive facts. What emerges from this biography behind and alongside Bacon, the artist, is a searching figure, both vulnerable and unafraid. Bacon, the man in all his complexity. And we're so delighted to welcome Mark Stevens and Annalyn Swan this evening. Annalyn Swan is a music critic and the former senior arts editor of Newsweek. She teaches biography and memoir writing at the CUNY Graduate Center and at the Middlebury Breadloaf School of English. Mark Stevens has been the critic for Newsweek, the New Republic, and New York Magazine, and has also written for The New Yorker, Vanity Fair, and the New York Times. Mark and Annalyn will be in conversation with Michael Cary, and Michael is a curator at Gagosian Gallery, where he's organized exhibitions on Manzoni and Bacon, as well as numerous Picasso exhibitions in collaboration with John Richardson and members of the Picasso family. He joined Gagosian in 2008 after several years in painting and sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. We will have the conversation and we'll leave some time for audience questions at the end. So please send us your questions using the link below or by emailing us, by emailing Evan at 192books.com. That's Evan at 192books.com. And now I'll pass it over to Michael. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anthony. Thanks. Hi, guys.
Hi there.
Hi. We're going to start. Francis Bacon created some of the most idiosyncratic and unexpected and challenging paintings of the post-war period. And it's the visuals, after all, are the reasons why we're interested in Bacon in the first place. And the reason why he is the subject of your new 705-page biography with 156 pages of back matter. And so in lieu of doing a reading, you're going to walk us through some images first that are in a montage that was put together by Hemi Productions in the UK. So I think if Evan can start that, and you guys can walk us through.
Okay, I'll begin. This will be about 10 minutes, and the purpose is really just to give you a taste and to fill your eyes with some images. I think that can probably enrich the conversation afterwards. So anyway, here we see Bacon with his mother. He was born into privilege, growing up in the Anglo-Irish world of the big houses around Dublin. And his mother was a wealthy Edwardian, stylish lady who rode side saddle. That world was already being upset, this world that you see here, by the glimmerings of Irish Revolution, the time of troubles. And so Bacon grew up with a feeling of threat around him, political threat and social threat. His emotional circumstances were, if anything, more challenging and difficult. He was an asthmatic whose parents did not know what to do with a girly, sickly child. His mother was more interested in horses and parties. His father was a dyspeptic, cold-hearted soldier who had no interest in anything, it seemed often, but horses. Next. Now here we see Bacon, women saved Bacon in effect. And on the left here, we see his Granny Supple, who was a fabulously rich and eccentric lady, not at all stuffy, who brought Bacon into the social world. He attended her, she introduced him into parties, and he began to see through her the joy of performance and of sparkle and of conversation and of perhaps even of misbehaving. To the right, you see his nanny, Nanny Lightfoot. She looks very starchy in this picture, but in fact, she was a mischievous working class woman who inspired in Bacon absolute loyalty. She was with him until her own death many decades later, and she would even clip the adverts with him when he was looking for male companionship later. Next.
This is Bacon's first success, which he strove mightily to bury for the rest of his life. This was a design show that he threw in 1930 at his 17 Queensberry Mews row house. The fact is, Bacon's first career for about 4 years was as an interior designer. He had gone to Paris for a year and a half, sort of curried favor with some of the people in the design world there. He was just too scared to become a painter at that point. But he did have this success with many women mentors, one of them, Madge Garland, who wrote an article called The 1930 Look in Decoration for the leading publication of the time on design and art in the UK. So he had a great success here. And you know, but it is really remarkable how he hid this for the rest of his life, one of the great Bacon evasions of all time. Next. This was his other early success, which he wrote out of the record when he said, I began in 1945. This is a 1933 Crucifixion that was obviously paid a debt to Pablo Picasso. On the left-hand side of the book in which it appeared, there was actually a Picasso, also a Crucifixion. So it was, you know, an enormously important first step by this designer who, through his connections, got to the Freddie Mayer Gallery, one of the great new fashionable galleries in London, right off Mayfair. And this resulted in a book by the leading critic, Herbert Reed, at the time. He did a publication called Art Now. This featured in that. Sir Michael Sadler, who was one of the great collectors of the time, bought this painting. So it would look as if Bacon were destined for a great early success, only to have it all go wrong. Next.
This is the famous 3 studies for figures at the base of a crucifixion, the triptych that launched Bacon's career at the end of World War II. It's vile, and I think that's the right word, it's vile orange color, which is reminiscent of wartime fires, scalded the eyes of Londoners at that time, who were really mostly interested in retiring into the dim and cozy drawing rooms of London, recovering that kind of cozy English life after the horrors of the war. The eyeless, toothy monster in the center with the bandage was shocking because I think he appeared so strangely friendly, intimate, as if he knows you. In other words, the monster in this painting is not simply bad guys, the Germans, the quote unquote other. The monster is us. The monster is a familiar, the human creature. We called the book Revelations in part because Bacon was always seeking that kind of feeling, that revelatory moment when the curtain is drawn back and there's some difficult truth to confront. Next. This is Head 1948. We nicknamed it in the book Mr. Hyde, as in Dr. Jekyll's other side. In this painting, the face all but slides off the great tradition or performance, you could say, of English portraiture. You can see the man's ear on the left there. His face has slid off his head, or partly slid off his head, to reveal the rather poignant animal within. There's no line in English art more exquisitely taut or painful than the one that's attached to the figure's ear, which seems to release the face from the head. Next.
So this is one of the Bacon famously screaming popes. He painted 6 of them in the early 1950s. This was a study after Velasquez's Pope Innocent X. David Sylvester said that this was sort of the epitome of, or the apex of Bacon's old master paintings, this 1953. This was the last of the Pope series. Then he went on to his famous sort of businessman closeted figures. But here clearly Bacon is dealing with figures of authority, a theme that he dealt with throughout his entire life. We write of this painting that it looks as if Pope Innocent has seen not the Holy Father, but the devil himself. Next.
This is Peter Lacy, the great love of Bacon's life. Bacon liked to pretend that he was invulnerable to love. He always put love in scare quotes. But in fact, he fell head over heels in love with this man. Their relationship has regularly been caricatured as a kind of violent, sadomasochistic, absurdist folly. In fact, despite the violence and the turmoil, it was by far the most meaningful and poignant relationship in the lives of both men. And it ended only with Lacy's death in 1962. Next. This is Two Figures, 1953, occasionally called, jokingly and not, the Buggers. It shows 2 men having sex, almost certainly Bacon and Lacy, in a dark and blurry atmosphere. It's an iconic portrayal of homosexual passion. It could not be exhibited in 1953 when it was made. Lucian Freud, not himself homosexual, kept it over his bed until the end of his life. Freud probably loved the paint handling, the composition, but also the extraordinary way the painting captures both ferocity and tenderness. Next.
This is one of Bacon's great paintings for many reasons. He's obviously known for all the men, from the popes to the businessmen to all the other males that occupy his paintings. But also Bacon did a surprising number of paintings of women, and particularly of Isabel Rawsthorne, who was was a sort of great presence on the scene, in the art world, the literary scene of both London and Paris from the late 1940s all the way through to the 70s. She'd once been a lover of Giacometti. She had enormous presence. So this is Isabel Rawsthorne standing in a street in Soho. We write of this that it looks like she's a duchess, Bohemian duchess surveying her subjects. And Bacon throughout the 60s returned again and again to paint Isabel. I think he painted all told something like 20 portraits of her. Next. So here are the boys dressed to go out on the town about 1965. The man on the left is George Dyer. The legend was that Dyer, who was a sort of petty thief and sort of cat burglar, fell through the skylight of Bacon's 7 Rees Medio's studio. Bacon took one look at him and said, I'm going to report you to the police unless we go to bed right away and have sex. This was actually not the story, the great story of legend. In fact, they met at a sort of very debonair homosexual bar near Harrods. But the truth of the matter was Bacon was absolutely fascinated by Cockney criminals and thugs. And so he, not to mention that George Dyer was very, very handsome and a sort of Greek with his sort of great beaked nose way. But poor George turned out to be very, very hapless and bumbling. Bacon's great friend, Lucian Freud, the painter, said that, poor George was utterly, just completely a screw up. And in the end, by the end of their relationship, the bloom was off the rose, and poor George was destined for a very unhappy death. Next. So here is actually in the background is the death beat. This is Francis Bacon at Le Tram Bleu restaurant right after the magnificent opening of his 1971 retrospective at the Grand Palais in Paris. It was a smash, a sensation in England, in France, across the continent. It was 134 works. The previous artist who had a retrospective there was Pablo Picasso, Bacon's great idol. So here he is entertaining 500 people after Pompidou was at the center to welcome him, all these French officials. And upstairs in their hotel room back on the left bank, George Dyer had died the night before of an overdose of drugs and alcohol. The hotel, very accommodatingly, allowed the body to be discovered 24 hours later so that the show could go on, literally. So here is this man after this magnificent event, but knowing that his lover was dead of an overdose. Next.
This is Triptych, August 1972. It's one of several triptychs that Bacon painted after Dyer's death. And together they represent a deep, varied, and sustained meditation on death, something that's rarely found in 20th century art. There's something almost distantly religious about what Bacon did in this period in these triptychs as he meditated upon death. And it's another reason for the title of the book, Revelations. In any case, here in the two side panels, you can see that Dyer is still alive. In the central one, he's dead. I'm always struck in this particular picture with the central panel by that cold violet pool, that implacable violet. Violet, a color that's more often found describing flowers, but that cold, implacable violet, and there is no heartbeat to disturb that surface. A chilling image of death. Next.
So these are two self-portraits. Bacon began painting his portraiture in 1960, and that was the first self-portrait he painted. But over the years, as his friends died off, he came to complain more and more about he had to use himself as a subject. So there dozens of these self-portraits, big, small, and they kind of get lost in the triptychs, but they're beautiful and very poignant often. The one on the left is particularly poignant. That is of Bacon, as we call him, as an aging queen. It's 1979. His great friends, Muriel Belcher of the Colony Club and the Soho Legend, had died. John Deacon, the photographer, died. Sonia Orwell had died. His world was shrinking. His last young man of great significance in his life, John Edwards, who he had met in the mid 1970s, was very portraying to Bacon more and more that he would continue to have his own life. So he felt isolated, unhappy. And then, so hence the autobiographical, the features of this that are telegraphed to us, whereas the one on the right in 1972 is just an absolutely beautiful self-portrait of a contemplative Francis Bacon. His portraits tended to show very dramatic brush strokes, and sometimes where his face was almost unrecognizable, as in, a lot of Bacon paintings, but somehow the essence of Bacon would come through, just as the essence of the person would come through in his portraits, no matter how distorted they were. Next.
Bacon is best known for his portrayal of the 20th century scream, but actually he was just as good at whispers as those self-portraits indicate. This is his very last painting, his farewell to the ring. Like Picasso, he enjoyed the ancient theater of bullfights, but here he used, instead of the panoply of color that you ordinarily see at a bullfight, here he used only hushed grays, which he mixed with actual dust, hushed grays and whites, the dust that all his life filled his asthmatic lungs. One horn of this annunciatory bull, who is surely bringing Bacon the matador the news of his approaching death, is shaped like a scythe, an ancient symbol of scythe, an ancient symbol of mortality. All right, that's enough of the show. We've buried the hero.
The bull did him in.
Thank you so much. Listen, I mean, that last painting is a gift to a biographer, right? I mean, it's sort of, it's foreboding and it tells us things. Bacon, of course, died. We're going to begin at the end, but Bacon, of course, died in Spain. Bullfighting is not what one immediately thinks of when they think of British painting in the 20th century, but the bullfight is a performance, right? And it's a performance that's full of cruelty and mercy and daring. And it seems like, the matador's job in the bullfight is to give the bull a beautiful and valiant death through his performance. And it struck me because performing and performance is a theme that runs throughout your book. And I'm wondering if you could maybe talk about Bacon in relation to performance.
That really goes to the heart of the book, actually, Michael, because, we think of it as sort of, Bacon had two great accomplishments in his life. One were the paintings, and I'm sure Mark will talk about the bullfight some more, but the other was his persona, the myth of Bacon, which we all know, and carousing around Soho, the drinking all night, blah. It is so well known, and headline after headline, it reinforced that even after Bacon's death. And there was a lot of truth in that, that performance. On the other hand, there was so much hidden beneath the performance, and that was what was so important for us to bring out in the book, even though some people disliked the fact that we were portraying the legend in some way that was different from the sort of legendary Bacon. But, the fact is that he was very, very controlling about what he wanted people to see. And in terms of both his personal life and his art, he made a pact with David Sylvester in the 1950s that the two of them would sort of write up Bacon's legend, his life, his paintings. And, he was, David Sylvester was like the right-hand man in getting this done. But really a truly Wildean figure, but a Wildean figure who had such a shyness beneath it, went back to his childhood, the desperate need for drugs and alcohol to keep this going. So what we did was kind of unpeel the onion to get to the other layers, try to get to the inner Bacon, not just the myth.
Yeah, he was such a theatrical man, such a theatrical figure. He revealed in his art what he concealed in his life, really. In his life, he wanted only to appear powerful. Very good example of that, and to suppress the weakness that he also understood so well. A good example of that is really how he treated his own past after he became well known, so that he not only disguised his career as an interior designer, brief as it was, he also concealed his long struggle as a young painter in the 1930s. He was almost a prototypical example of the tortured young artist in a garret. He lived that way. He had some success, but more failure. He stayed up all night working. He painted violent pictures in his bedroom that he didn't let anyone see. I mean, a real portrait of a young artist. He didn't want anyone to know that, because that would suggest a kind of weakness, a kind of cliche, a kind of requirement that people must develop over time, evolve. Instead, he wanted to seem, as we say in the book, I forget how it's put exactly, but fully born, as if from the head of Zeus, a master, immediately. So his, you know, the performance is a marvelous thing, and it's true, but the weakness is also true.
Mm-hmm. And the performance is sort of essential to understanding Bacon, just as the other parts are. You wrote in the book about the partnership with David Sylvester that, in a funny way, it was Bacon learning his lines.
Absolutely.
Right. Sort of practicing the script with Sylvester.
Exactly, and David Sylvester was so accommodating. You know, when he wrote his famous interview book, you know, that became the Bible, he would submit all of those the questions and answers to Bacon himself, and then they would the two of them would hone the cones about who Francis Bacon really was. And one little digression from there too is, I think it would surprise our readers to know just how controlling Francis Bacon was about his image and his shows. And for example, when he was having his first major show in the States at the Met in 1975, the voluminous correspondence that went back and forth between Francis Bacon trying to get Rousseau, who was then the head of the Met, to intervene in the show because he didn't want Henry Geldzahler to be, you know, hanging the show. You would be amazed. I mean, that Francis Bacon would take the time to personally write so many, many letters. And he did a campaign to get himself into the Grand Palais. So there again, you know, he knew enough to be shrewd. He wasn't just this, you know, genius in his 7 Reese Mule pigsty of a studio.
Yeah, and not just a drunk in the bar either, right? I mean, this is a very calculating kind of scenario.
There were people who even thought that he did get massively drunk quite often, but there were also times where, as with the journalist Melvin Bragg, where people believe that he didn't really drink as much as he appeared to drink. He was trying to get other people drunk so that they would be revelatory. They would expose themselves in some way. And that interview is famous because Melvin Bragg, I mean, usually the interviewer is supposed to be in control, but in fact, by the end of that, it looks like Melvin Bragg has completely lost his way.
Yeah, exactly. Like drinking each other under the table, kind of. Yeah.
But that was a performance, you know, too. I mean, they were both performers, Bragg and Bacon, right? And they knew exactly what they were doing. It's naive to think otherwise. They intentionally set out to jostle the TV cliche a bit by actually getting drunk on the air.
Yeah, to Mark's point, he was also known at the colony, you know, in this great sea of drunk people, and he would kind of stagger his way over to the loo and then pour his drink in and then come back. So he was always, you know, he wanted to be in control.
It's funny though, because I mean, we're living in a time when artists have to have Instagram accounts and websites and Twitter feeds and have to position themselves. And in social media, people talk about branding, right? Which is kind of ridiculous. It seems kind of insane that people are branding, but Bacon did this a bit in his time. He did it through interviews and through radio, and through television. But it seems like
except that it's very natural the way it emerges so much from his sense of internal theatricality, power and powerlessness, and these different elements. It really is not fundamentally, it's really not a calculation to get ahead in the world. He did very little he was obsessed with how his art was presented, framed. You know, his frames are something else, right? Yeah, and his pictures themselves often have a theatrical stage in them, kind of. But he was not driven by success in the way an Instagram artist might be or a branded artist might be. This persona was a genuine creation of its own, a great role that emerged out of his own psyche in a very genuine way, I think.
And it seems like in a way it's him. It's a way to deal with the attention he was getting rather than to gain more attention.
Yes, and also Gray Gowry, you know, the poet, and he was also the head of the Arts Council in England for a while. he said that he thought that Francis Bacon was a terrific grandee, and that he didn't have, and he said not in the sense of being immensely well-born, although Bacon was very well-born indeed on both sides of his family. But he said it wasn't so much a grandee in that sense as a grandee who had complete disregard in the end for public opinion or the popular opinion. He was going to do what he was going to do, and that makes a point about how strong Francis Bacon really was, despite what we're telling you. He had a sort of grand disregard for the opinion of the world in many ways. Just like he also, at a time that it was still very dangerous to be a homosexual, he never hid it. He just had this ability to not react to public perception.
But Annalyn, he also had such good manners. David Sylvester famously said he was never rude unintentionally, so that he didn't want to make people unhappy about his homosexuality, really. He knew when to use the he/she thing. He would often refer to men as she. So there's a funny story that he, when he was in New York with Jason McCoy, who's a relative of Jackson Pollock, and he thought Jason McCoy was kind of cute. And so he mentioned to his neighbor at the table, he said, oh, she's the niece of the old lace maker. The old lace maker being Jackson Pollock.
Yeah, of course.
So he would only do that, though. He would never do that in a way that would make most people uncomfortable. He would talk that language, with his inside group.
Yeah, I mean, and it's daring and it's risky. You said when you were talking about the Buggers, right? The Buggers is a painting that couldn't be shown in the 1950s.
Also, they had sort of a companion painting, which was also 1953, also two figures, and it was called Two Figures in the Grass.
Yeah.
And, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to figure out what they're doing in that painting. Now, 1953, coincidentally, was when Lord Montagu, the sort of famous homosexual case in the UK, came up. He was Lord Montagu and this Peter Wildeblood were convicted and sentenced to a year in prison because they had been accused, and then they were tried and accused of propositioning servicemen. So in the very same year, when the public was consumed with this new crackdown on homosexuality, here was Bacon showing Two Figures in the Grass in a 1953 show. So two women were appalled at this, and they went off and reported him to the police. And the police actually came to it was Institute of Contemporary Art. They came to the Institute, they looked at the painting, they pronounced it not buggering, and no charges were brought. But that was a very fine line to walk in 1953. And as Mark said, he never hid his homosexuality. He was kind of so secure in his world, I guess, and in his self in a way, that he made no effort to finally, be covert.
Yeah, I mean, he's sort of performing in the opposite direction, right?
Right.
He's not performing to conceal things, or to conceal his homosexuality. It's sort of out there in the open.
Exactly.
I mean, yeah, one of the ways that performance and persona is so clear in your book is because you have done the work of filling in the details of Bacon's life that are not the performance, right? And so I'm wondering, the Bacon persona has a large place in the popular imagination, and you are giving us a Bacon that people don't know. And I'm wondering, what are some of the most important discoveries or revelations that you came across in writing the book that were important for you? What are the things that you uncovered?
Well, as I mentioned before, there are many, there's much information about his youth that no one has known about, and that give us a different idea about how his character developed and evolved and what kind of man he is. But I think really the revelations in this respect are, throughout the book, he's engaged in a kind of dance between revealing and concealing. a very modernist sort of dance, of course, because that's a very modernist theme, and also playing between power and powerlessness. And if you can narrate that, as I hope we do, over time, that becomes a revelation about a certain kind of person in the world. We all have public faces, of course, and we all behave in different ways in different circumstances. But Bacon designed a relationship between his inner life and his public persona that is so rich and complex that the revelation that most interests me, for example, is not something brassy, not a hoo-ha. We didn't suddenly discover that he actually wasn't gay and had a wife in Essex or something. I mean, it's not that kind of revelation. It's a revelation of the dynamics of character, of how an artist thinks and works over time.
And to that, I would add that the level of his shyness, was never brought out before. His childhood really was singularly unappealing because he had such terrible asthma, and he was plunked down in this society of the so-called Big House Society of Anglo-Ireland. And nothing that he had, he couldn't bring anything to the table. He couldn't hunt, which his father wanted him to do. Every single time he got around a horse or one of the hunting dogs, he would start, going into his suffocating mode. And so he never had any friends who were boys. The only friends that we could find ever in his childhood, and we went back to Ireland and, did the whole research there, they were girls. And, he had tennis player friends who were girls. He had pianist friends who were girls. But he had a very lopsided, very isolated and lonely life. He only went to school in a proper school for a year and a half. So so much of his life before then was a private tutors. He went to even private tutors were late. So really he had most of us start socializing and our process of socialization when we're about 3 or 4, right? But he was isolated, and as a result, he was terrifyingly shy. A fact he also didn't admit very much. But as he went through life, the shyness never left him, and he was truly dependent upon alcohol and many, many drugs, portfolios of drugs. The most important people in his life, one could argue, were Dr. Stanley and Paul Brass, the physicians who took care of him his whole life. And when he got into desperate straits, they would give him intravenous sedatives. So that's a whole side of Bacon that that was never seen before. And a very last poignant note about that. The last man in his life, Jose Capello, who was the Spaniard where Bacon went when he finally died in Madrid, it was to go see Jose Capello. And Jose Capello said that Bacon, in his old age, was so fearful of going to a fancy dinner party that he would actually write out in advance some questions he could ask. So imagine that. Imagine the inner turmoil in this, extravagant, dazzling matador on the stage of Soho, and put them together, which is what we try to do.
He also had no education. He didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge. He barely went to school, barely went to art school. So you know what it was like in the England of those days when if you hadn't had any kind of education, even if you came from a very fancy background. But I also think another important revelation about the book is, and again, some people don't like to know this, is that Bacon really was capable of falling in love. And he had, although he certainly liked to screw around, and he was very good at that, and he liked rough trade, he also had this series of long-term relationships, and he didn't walk away from them. In fact, he stayed with George Dyer died, and Peter Lacy died. In neither case did he really finally cut the cord with those two lovers. And the same is true later in his life. So he has these sustained emotional relationships, and that cuts against the grain of this swaggering, swordsman who drinks in Soho and all that kind of thing. And it's interesting that the two things exist at once. I mean, that's an interesting thing about character. It's a novelistic kind of understanding of a rich character. But some people really don't want that. Some people want the flat character. They want the easily grasped, flat sort of person.
Yeah, I mean, the main revelation in the book is that Bacon was a whole person, right?
Yeah,
And
in a way, yeah.
he wasn't just this story from the days in Soho. It's funny, you mentioned Peter Lacy. I mean, the Peter Lacy information is one of the biggest, for me, one of the biggest revelations in the book, because in a lot of Bacon writing, Lacy is almost a footnote, right? And he's sort of dismissed in a few lines. How did you tease out the Lacy information? Where did that information come from, and how did you put it together?
Well, the first thing is that we went and found his relatives. I mean, that was the beginning of the breadcrumb trail. He had two nephews, one of them a Catholic priest, because obviously Peter Lacy came from a Roman Catholic family. But Father David Lacy and the other nephew, Gerald Powell, met us one day for a wonderful pub lunch. And about 4 hours later, they're still telling us these things about Peter Lacy that had never been revealed.
Yeah, see, that was another thing we hoped or tried to do with Peter Lacy as best we could. Also, what we did with Bacon to present a rounded figure. I mean, Lacy was a man with problems. He was violent when he got drunk. He had sadistic tendencies, but he could also be funny, droll, great company. And Bacon really admired his mind, not just his bod. He was a very elegant man, Peter Lacy. He drove beautiful cars. He dressed beautifully. He was a jazz pianist, kind of thwarted in all kinds of ways, a sympathetic and poignant figure, as well as a kind of scary one. And to try to get that, those different elements again, working as one in the mind of the reader, so that you can have a rounded feeling about Bacon and Lacy as a relationship. That was a real challenge. But as Annalyn said, the breadcrumbs began when we spoke to the family who didn't recognize the person who was described in other books. They never saw that.
At the other end of the trail, we unearthed this incredibly poignant letter written by a man who saw Peter Lacy in a bar in Algeciras, Spain, not very long before he died. And so he was a blind man sitting at the bar, and Peter Lacy came in, and for whatever reason, just probably because he was blind, just began to tell him about this great love of his life, Francis Bacon. And the level of the emotion there, it was always assumed that Peter Lacy was, as Mark said, this sort of, cold S&M guy. But in fact, what this man at the bar reported later in a long letter to the Tate was that he had never seen a man so broken and so in love as Peter Lacy at the bar, crying. And he left the bar, got into his car, and promptly totaled it. This was a man who then had to walk to the ferry to get back to Tangier, where he lived. A quite poignant end to this whole story. And then he dies on the very day of Bacon's Tate retrospective, his first big retrospective in 1962. He receives a telegram that says, Peter Lacy has died. Wow.
Right. And I mean, and terrifying that 10 years later, the George Dyer death on the eve of the Grand Palais as well.
Bacon always thought, when Bacon was gambling, his game was roulette, he sort of thought that the way a lot of gamblers do, that the voices were talking to him, that fate was saying, put the money on this number or that color, and he'd play two tables at a time. But he had a feeling, and that's part of his love of ancient classical Greek culture. He had a kind of, he didn't believe in fate he didn't think that there were little creatures up there designing human lives, but he had a visceral feeling about fate. That's one of the things he loved about ancient culture, was that sense of fate. And so when Dyer dies, so like the way that Lacy dies, 10 years after it is great shows. It is like an ancient sacrifice. It's downright weird, right? And you can sort of hear the bells chiming or somewhere as some mysterious power, some mysterious power is pulling the strings. And, you wonder what Bacon himself could have thought about that, I mean, because it's so unlikely and it's so mysterious. But I'm sure it only confirmed his predilections in that direction.
And like,
oh, sorry.
no, go ahead.
I was just going to say where his lighter side emerged, I think, was in his relationships with women, which is one of the things we also went into at great length in the book, which had not been done before.
Yeah.
And so they began, as Mark said, with Granny Supple and Nanny Lightfoot, but then all the way through his life with the great Isabel Rawsthorne, the heroine, of the left bank. And then, Sonia Orwell, a troubled but exceedingly intelligent, woman who was, very much involved in the literary world of London. But, in the letters to the women friends, you can see him really letting down his hair. He did not really, he wasn't threatened by women. There was no kind of posturing necessary in the same way that there was with men. And as we remark in the book, Isabel Rawsthorne, who was a painter herself, as well as being this great presence on the stage in two countries. But he would discuss art with her in really the most sort of intimate way. And all these letters that we discovered at the Tate that were written between mostly from Isabel Rawsthorne to another friend about her conversations with Bacon. But it brought into perspective too this side, who really thought that Bacon was a great friend of women, other than with, say, the Muriel Belcher of Soho fame. But there were all these other friendships he had, and yet again another dimension emerges about him.
And the portrait that you guys paint of Valerie Beston at the gallery, Valerie from the gallery, is beautiful, right? And it's like there's more about Valerie in your book than I think anywhere else. And the relationship was complicated, but she was a fascinating character. She was a minder. She worked at Bletchley Park during the war. I mean, it showed, there's a point in time when Bacon said something, I think that she's in love with me, she doesn't realize that I'm a homosexual, something like that.
Well, she's a great secondary character, again, like these other ones we've been talking about. She's one of those, I always think of her as sort of a bit like Miss Marple, sort of all pocketbook, one of these sturdy, dominating English ladies whose lives seem to be in their pocketbook, and it's a kind of a little frightening. And they run everyone's existence. And she did that at the Marlborough Gallery. She was very, very important. She was the person who made the trains run on time. But she did have this platonic, but sort of strangely English, complicated love affair with Francis Bacon. There's no other word for it. They would see each other on Sundays to go to the movies. They would have dinner occasionally. Lots of things were never said, but they didn't need to be said. One of those kinds of Jamesian sort of relationships.
Another thing you mentioned recently, you're talking about Bacon being self-taught and having no education. What are the implications of him being self-taught? How did that play out to his advantage, to his disadvantage?
Well, two things about that, Michael. One is that he really was a little bit more taught than he ever acknowledged. I mean, his sister remembered that he would bring home drawings from a drawing class in Ireland. He would bring home to Ireland drawings that he'd done in Paris. So for the year and a half that he was in Paris, before he got kind of swept up in the design world, he was going to schools. He stayed originally with a French family and would go to and from that family, the Bocatin family, every week to his art classes. And then he had the great good fortune immediately upon landing it back in London to become great friends with Roy de Maistre, who showed him, as Roy de Maistre later said, not how to paint, but the techniques of painting, how you actually get paint on the canvas. And so, you see that he was an autodidact, but he also had some. There were other dimensions to that.
But it was still very important that he didn't know how to do that. He wasn't trained in an art school, and he was always very clear about that. He didn't want to be trained in an art school because he instinctively understood that what could make him original was was not art school. That would make him like everyone else, but having to find his own way. So he's a very awkward artist, you know. I mean, I think we talked about this earlier, Michael, but trained artists really pay attention to figure-ground relationships. So did Bacon. He knew to do that, but he didn't have all these tricks that artists learn about how to do things. And so his art has a kind of jagged quality. The relationship between figure and ground is often utterly fascinating, I think, because the ground is this rather terrifying blankness, you know, which can become a powerful symbol or image of power and a kind of just unmodified power. And then the figure squirming, you know, and to make those two things work together, the blankness and the squirm, is very interesting. But you know, an art teacher's not going to say to you, make the blankness and the squirm work, right? I mean, so he had to figure out his own way, and his own way is filled with problems and issues, but it also leads to particular insights and originality.
Well, we talk about his creative method as being the art of destruction, because he really did destroy hundreds of paintings, you know, and, you know, if he couldn't make the figure ground come together or whatever, he would just destroy it. John Edwards, his Cockney boyfriend, had the job of going in and you know, razoring off all of the canvases, rolling them up and tossing them. And many more, probably hundreds of paintings went that way that have never seen the light.
Bacon loved the idea of sacrificing his art. You know, he was never at all sad about cutting up a painting or destroying a painting. It was a kind of, you know, a sacrifice that he absolutely enjoyed. I mean, he loved doing it. He loved cutting it up and throwing it out and bleeding it dead.
It's also a gamble, right? It's like
a lost bet.
Yeah. I think we have to take questions pretty soon, but can I ask just a couple more things? You have said that Bacon is perhaps the darkest artist of a very dark century, right? And he lived through the Irish Troubles and World Wars and the AIDS crisis. I want to ask if it was depressing at all to spend 10 years of your life working on Bacon.
What a question. So I think the short answer would be, for 10 years, we had to traverse this man's life as well as his work, right? So the art of darkness was certainly there at all points, but he was born in Ireland into this Anglo-Irish world. He lived in London and particularly was a denizen of Soho. He spent a lot of time in the south of France. He, in later years, had a studio in Paris. He spent 3 or 4 wonderfully colorful years, wildly colorful years in Tangier. And finally, he had, you know, the last great love of his life, Jose Copello in Spain. Now, I submit, there are tougher things than to do what Mark and I did, which was tromp literally around, you know, soaking up all the vibes of all these different places, going into the archives. That part was heavenly.
Yeah, no, he was funny and charming and witty and dark, and you know, who would want charm all the time? Who would want funny, happy all the time? I mean, that's not interesting. So he had these both qualities. He was both a melancholy character and a bright, effervescent character. He said he adored life. So no, it wasn't depressing to be with him. It was interesting to try to understand him.
Get inside that head.
Okay, Evan at 192 has sent through some questions. So can I ask
Sure.
one of the questions? Lucy asks, Mark and Annalyn, did your writing process change between the de Kooning book and this one? And does a different artist require a completely different approach?
That's a very good question. You know, you can't change yourself all that much, so that there are many connections of process between the two books. I mean, I think in both cases, we were interested in that 19th century novel kind of feeling where you have a social context and world, but also a main character and many secondary figures moving through time. I think in both cases, we liked doing that. And in both cases, we broke out certain works of art to separate them from the text in order to sort of exhibit a certain modesty about what you can and cannot know about the relationship between the life and the art. As for differences, I think that Bacon was such a, go ahead. You go ahead,
Can I
Annalyn.
about differences? Because, you know, for Lucy's question, I think one of the most interesting differences was we were going from de Kooning, who of course had a totally different artistic style and sensibility from Bacon, but he also was a guy's guy. You know, he was the ultimate guy at the Cedar Bar in the Village in New York. And, you know, he had these incredible relationships with women. And so that is a certain kind of, he was of course fascinated. Women were his great subject, or woman was his great subject. Then we go to Francis Bacon, who is dark, as you were saying, Michael. You know, everything about him was sort of distorted in a way that never was true with de Kooning. But we also had to enter a whole different way of looking at his environs, you know, that the world of Soho and the sort of the subterranean gay world, or not so subterranean, was, you know, a challenge. And as biographers, you have to really get in there, you know, try to imagine your way into these totally different worlds.
But she was asking about process, and I think a process or approach to the material yielded very different results, but I think there's quite a lot of similarities between the way we actually went about it.
But I'm taking it to a higher level, Mark, the process of thinking, you know, thinking through to your central person's, you know, what makes that person tick.
There's another question. Robert asks, what initially drew you to Bacon? Was there a particular work that made you think this should be your next project, or something that emerged during the initial research that pointed you that way?
Well, for me, it was that he's one of those rare artists who has a symbolic relationship to his time. He's an emblematic figure, so that in addition to his art, whatever you may think of it, as you were suggesting, he sort of sets the dark or outer edge of visual art in the 20th century. That's automatically an interesting thing, philosophically, socially, and otherwise, in addition to painting, so that it brings those dimensions in. So I think neither Annalyn, you say what you think too, but I don't think neither Annalyn nor I are particularly dark people. I think that was also an attraction, frankly, because if you're going to be working on these books, you might as well stretch a bit, you know? I mean, yes, I'd rather have Agnes Martin in my bedroom, but it doesn't mean I can't stretch and try to understand a little better Francis Bacon too.
I think my response to that would be, of the great painters, there are not that many that have a great life story. I mean, if you look at this purely from a biographer's point of view, there's a wonderful backstory in de Kooning, you know, de Kooning, the immigrant who makes good, comes to America, makes good. Well, Francis Bacon also had just an amazing backstory. And no major biography had been written about Bacon in 25 years, you know, and there was a lot of revisionist thinking that can happen over a quarter of a century. So he seemed like such a darkly fascinating choice. Maybe when we were going in, we were also thinking that, okay, now time to look at, you know, a totally different kind of personality from de Kooning. But then as we went in deeper and deeper, of course, all these other layers of Bacon emerged. I mean, there's no question that he is not only, you know, a visionary in terms of his art of the 20th century. He created some of the great portraits of the 20th century, which nobody ever talks about. What a story, you know, and for biographers, that's catnip.
And also, you know, there have been other biographies of Bacon, but they're not the sort of objective research based, right? They were written by intimates and friends, and so there's elements of memoir, and Bacon is a big enough subject that had not been dug through yet in the way that you guys have
Also, you know, frankly, a lot of people just hate his work, which is, you know, there's this, especially in America. I mean, the American critical establishment has never warmed to Bacon. The European, quite the opposite. They're bananas about Bacon usually, but in this country, not so much. That's also interesting to me. The charge that he's just a creator of Grand Guignol and so on, you know, negotiating that, figuring that out, addressing that, all of that is a challenge and interesting.
Can I ask, Veronica asks if there are any other biographers or critics who particularly inspired you as you wrote the book or across your career?
Since I teach a class, I have very determined opinions about this, but Mark and I do agree on this particular book. It is Richard Ellman's Oscar Wilde, because Richard Ellman is just a beautiful writer, you know, and just a dazzling craftsman. And that is an interesting aspect of biography. You know, once you figure out your subject and all of the other things and you dig in so deeply, you still have to tell a really compelling story. You know, and a lot of biographers forget this little fact. I mean, they get, you know, you get sidelined or derailed by, you know, facts and chronologies and everything else. But essentially, as Leon Adele, you know, the great biographer of Henry James said, you know, a novelist should write biographies. You know, a biographer is as much a storyteller as a historian or anybody else, you know. So what is essential is that you bring to this a style, you know, and you work on your writing. So that's why Ellman springs to my mind. Mark, do you have a candidate?
Well, I would not so much a candidate, but an observation about the art world, which is that the art world is very suspicious, rightly so, of biography, because the assumption is that the biographer is going to reduce the art to the life, which is a mistake and it should not be done, or, you know, just the relationship will be vulgar. And I hope that we're not doing that. At the same time, art historians and critics, they're not often necessarily readers of biography. So they think that if you write a biography of Bacon or de Kooning, for example, really it should be art history, you know. But a biography is not art history. It can contribute to art history. It can help. It can help illuminate art history. But it's also many, many other things. And I think a lot of people don't understand that. They don't understand that a biography of an artist or a choreographer or a writer is also a biography is its own, you know, it's its own genre. It's a maybe minor, but it's a literary genre when it's done well. And it's not art history by other means.
Exactly. You know, I think some people would want more of the medium and, you know, the actual technical details of Bacon's paintings, and we touch on those, but that is, you know, that's not the narrative or the drive or the psychological insights that you want. A biography is really different.
Okay, can I ask another question from Jessica? Jessica asks, I'm struck by Mark's readings of some moments in the images as tender. Can you walk us through how and where specifically you see tenderness in Bacon's painting?
Well, if you look at, for example, those two self-portraits that Annalyn discussed earlier at the beginning, I would say both those portraits are extraordinarily melancholy and tender in an almost Rembrandt-like way. The brushstroke can be sharp, but it's the overall feeling is one of softness and dissolve. Now, if you're talking about the picture of homosexual sex, you know, painting sex is the hard. I mean, nobody ever succeeds in doing it, really. It's just too difficult. Sexy paintings are not about the sexual act ordinarily. They're erotic or sensual in other ways. Bacon, so Bacon has done an extraordinary thing here, and successfully, I think, painting a portrait of actual sex. If you look at the faces of the figures in that painting, you will see a very complicated feeling that is not easily defined in words, but it includes tenderness. And if you look at the atmosphere of the painting, beautiful kinds of blues and grays and melting whites and things like that, there's a tenderness in the surround that suggests a kind of a sadness or what is it? It's very complicated to describe, but it puts the sexual act into a context that is tender and sort of sad. That atmosphere, that extraordinary, those are colors. So anyway, I hope I've described a little bit what I mean. Doesn't mean he can't be fierce.
Okay, great. Can I ask maybe one last question? Joe asks if there are any painters working now, or some of Bacon's later contemporaries that you feel have picked up Bacon's mantle, or worked interestingly with any of the themes in Bacon's work.
Mark, you want to talk about Jenny Savile?
Well, Bacon's influence, I think, is not so much. I mean, yes, you can see him in Jenny Savile and some other painters, but his influence is less directly in terms of style or painterly effect, I think, than in two other things. One is a just resolute determination to hit the nerve, to find the dark spot, to get to the center of that. I think there's a lot of artists working today who would like to do that. The best artists who have a political outlook, for example, I think want to do that. They want to get to some central anxiety. Another way in which I think you can see his mantle, and this is a strange connection that he has with Andy Warhol, is exactly in the performance-based persona theatricality of his life and his work. I think that's a very postmodern thing. People have not spoken enough, I think, or talked enough. We allude to it in the book about Bacon's relationship and interest for postmodern culture, that theatrical quality, that sense of where is the center? Where can you find the meaning behind it all? That's a very postmodern sort of quality that's in his work. And at the same time, his work contains that drive towards some central nerve. I think that's how he influences more than just through the paint.
One little postscript to that too is in 1975, when Bacon had his show at the Met, Thomas Hess, the head of the editor of Art News, wrote a piece and said, now all of our art schools are flooded with would-be imitators of Francis Bacon. So, you know, at that particular time, he talked about, I think, going to the Biennale, and there were all of these Francis Bacon imitations. Well, it tells you something that all these years later, no one has had the wherewithal to do Bacon in another way. You know,
the headline on that piece was "Blood, Sweat, and Smears."
That's right. Unfortunately, Bacon was not beloved by a lot of American critics, but I just found it very interesting that at that point in time, all of these people had just flooded in to try to do proto-Bacon. But what happened? I mean, they weren't Bacon. You know, it was a very singular vision. David Sylvester said, what wonderful quote of David Sylvester said of Bacon's portraits, that they could hang in a country house, one of the great estates of England, and be the moldering painting at the end of the great line of ancestral portraits. I've always loved that. You know, David Sylvester had quite a way of talking about Bacon's art.
Okay, great. Evan at 192 has said that that's good, and we should wrap up and go back to Anthony. So thank you guys for talking.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much, and we'd really like to thank Anthony and the gallery for being with you tonight.
Thank you both for this great conversation. Such a great book. So once you started, you just want to go on. And I love particularly the way you bring to life the time of Bacon's travels in his youth when he goes to Weimar era Berlin or 1920s Paris. This really, and as you mentioned, there's a cast of secondary characters there that brings the whole thing to life, and it's just fascinating. So thank you so much for the conversation. We have copies of the book at 192 Books, so please come visit us on 10th Avenue between 21st and 22nd Street. We're open every day. You can also order the book by phone or email or use our bookshop page. And we will have a recording of this conversation up on our website, as well as the gallery's website, paulacoopergallery-studio.com. So if you've missed any part of it, or if you want to listen to it again, you'll be able to do this right away. Our next event is a discussion of Rachel Kushner's new book of collected essays called The Hard Crowd, and she'll be speaking with Ben Lerner. So that should be great, and it's going to be taking place on Tuesday, April 13th, so in a week from now. So please tune in again then. And in the meantime, thank you again to Annalyn, Mark, and Michael for this conversation.
Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you so
Good
much.
night.